The moment Richard Langford said, "This entire project would take only half the time if my son managed it," the conference room went so quiet I could hear my pulse in my teeth. I sat at the far end of the polished table, the only woman on the operations side of the board meeting, and every head subtly angled toward me. They acted like it was a neutral remark. It was not. It was a deliberate shot fired with perfect precision. Elias Mercer, the founder of Windhaven Systems, leaned back in his chair without flinching. The board members waited for him the way people wait for a judge to read a verdict, but he remained silent. Not yet. Richard folded his hands, eyes locked on me. "Connor understands the pace our clients demand." He continued, "Bella's approach is methodical." His voice lingered over the last word as if it were a flaw. Connor Langford sat 2 seats away, a crisp suit, a rehearsed jawline, and the smug kind of smile that only grows on someone who's never earned anything the hard way. When our eyes met, he raised one eyebrow like he was already predicting my exit. I felt the resignation letter in my notebook long before I touched it. I had printed it the night before, not because I wanted to quit, but because I understood the ground I was standing on. Richard had been plotting for weeks. The judgment in his voice only confirmed it. I stood slowly. "If you want your son to handle it," I said, keeping my tone steady, "then this belongs to you." I placed the folded letter on the table. Connor's smile stretched, sharp and triumphant. Elias finally spoke. "Fine," he said, voice cool and unreadable. "Give the project to his son." Richard exhaled like he'd scored a victory. Connor straightened in his chair. Then Elias turned his gaze toward me. "Bella," he said, "meet me in 10 minutes. Bring that resignation letter with you." His tone revealed no anger. It revealed no sympathy either. It revealed nothing at all. And somehow, that was worse. I stepped out of the boardroom with the letter in my hand, and the unsettling certainty that whatever waited behind Elias Mercer's closed door would change far more than my job title. When I first moved to Portland 10 years ago, I never imagined I'd end up sitting in boardrooms where someone else's ambition decided the worth of my work. I arrived with one suitcase, a used laptop, and the stubborn belief that if I worked hard enough, I could build a life that felt secure. Windhaven Systems was supposed to be part of that stability. During my early years there, Richard Langford barely acknowledged me. If he passed me in the hallway, he offered a curt nod and kept walking. Back then, his indifference was easier to stomach than what came later. "Bella, you always know which fire to put out first," my former director Lacey Monroe once told me. And I knew she meant it. During the pandemic, when every system buckled at once, I spent 14-hour days stitching together workflows that kept 2 failing contracts alive. Lacey called me her anchor. Richard called it luck. That was the first time I realized we lived in completely different realities. Connor entered the company soon after. Richard introduced him at a staff meeting with a proud hand on his shoulder. "Fresh eyes," he said, looking straight at me as if youth alone could replace experience. Connor shook my hand with a practiced smile. "I've heard your operations work is steady," he said, and the pause before the last word told me everything. It didn't take long for the subtle shifts to begin. A meeting that should have included me suddenly didn't require operations. A report I wrote came back with entire sections altered to remove my name. Data I had verified was changed before reaching the board, softening Connor's mistakes and erasing my fixes. When I mentioned it to my team, Jake lowered his voice. "We see it, Bella. We just can't push back. You know how Richard works." I knew. And I felt the ground start tilting beneath me long before Richard tried to push me out completely. The only thing I didn't know then was when he decided that removing me was worth risking the entire company. Connor Langford walked into Windhaven Systems like the building had been designed for him. He had the polished smile of someone who'd never heard the word no, an expensive degree, and a last name that opened doors faster than any resume could. His handshake was firm, practiced, and empty. "Looking forward to learning from you," he told me during his first week. The way he said it made it clear he expected the learning to be optional. The shift began quietly. A report I finalized came back with Connor's notes scribbled across the margins. "Just tightening the language," he said, even though his revisions introduced errors I later had to fix. In a team meeting, I presented the updated workflow. Connor jumped in before I finished. "Actually, I walked the team through this on Monday," he announced. The room flicked their eyes toward me. Jake opened his mouth to correct him, but I shook my head. It wasn't worth humiliating him in front of everyone, not yet. A few days later, one of my analysts, Mariah, caught me outside the break room. Connor had pulled us aside. She whispered, "He said the company needs fresher thinking. He said, you were steady but old school." I felt the sting in my throat, but I kept my voice calm. "Thank you for telling me." The more Connor pushed, the more Richard praised him. "He sees the future," Richard said in a meeting, tapping Connor's shoulder. "We cannot cling to outdated methods." Board members began repeating the exact phrases Richard used: modernization, new leadership energy, cutting dead weight. Their eyes drifted toward me each time. I started documenting everything: emails, timestamps, discrepancies, conversations. I didn't know what I would eventually need, only that the ground was shifting faster than I could hold it steady. Richard was no longer treating me like an employee. He was treating me like an obstacle, and I needed to understand why he felt threatened enough to rewrite the company's narrative. Richard's first performance update landed in my inbox on a Thursday morning. The subject line was neutral, but the content was anything but. My name appeared only once, tucked into a tiny bullet point at the bottom of the page: operation support provided as needed. I stared at it for a long moment before forwarding it to my team. Jake responded almost immediately. "Where are the risk mitigation metrics and the salvage work on the 2 contracts?" I typed back, "Ask Richard." I knew he would not. At the next leadership meeting, Richard projected the updated report on the screen. "As you can see," he said, tapping the slide, "process inefficiencies stem from outdated workflows. Bella's methods worked years ago, but volume demands a different approach now." I kept my eyes on the table. Outdated workflows was code for anything I built. Connor leaned forward with faux modesty. "I've been testing a new pipeline. With enough support, we can shave weeks off delivery." One of the board members, Helen Rodas, nodded. "Speed is what matters now." I spoke quietly but firmly. "Speed without accuracy puts us at risk. Several steps Connor removed are required in the client contract." Richard's smile tightened. "Contracts can be renegotiated." "They can," I said, "but not without disclosing operational changes." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then another board member chimed in, echoing Richard's earlier phrasing: "We need modernization, not resistance." There it was, the echo I feared. Words don't travel that far unless they've been planted. Through it all, Elias Mercer sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression unreadable. He neither agreed nor disagreed, he simply watched. By the end of the meeting, the damage was clear. The board didn't just hear Richard, they believed him. And Elias's silence meant he saw exactly what was happening, but was choosing not to intervene yet. I left the room wondering what purpose that silence served, and why he wanted to see how far Richard would push. Elias Mercer's office door was already open when I approached, resignation letter in hand. He didn't gesture for me to sit. He simply looked at me with an expression impossible to read. "Close the door, Bella." I did. My palms were damp, the letter warm from how tightly I'd held it. He nodded toward it. "You brought that this morning." Yes. Why? His voice was even, not accusing, almost curious. I met his eyes. Richard has been clearing the path for Connor for months. Today wasn't spontaneous, and if I stayed silent any longer, I would become the excuse they needed to tear the project apart. Elias studied me closely. What do you think Connor cannot handle? I didn't soften the truth. The dependencies, the contractual layers, the risk structures I negotiated during the pandemic. There are workflows that only make sense because of how they were built, step by step, with the client's priorities in mind. Remove the wrong one, and the entire thing collapses. He exhaled slowly. I suspected as much. Suspected what? My pulse jumped. That Richard has been falsifying progress data, he said, glossing over Connor's mistakes, presenting selective metrics. He tapped his desk. The numbers did not align, but I needed confirmation. I held my breath. And now you have it, he said, nodding, eyes sharpening. I do. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he opened a drawer and slid a business card toward me. North River Analytics. They are one of our most critical partners. I frowned. You want me to work for them? I want you where Richard cannot manipulate you or the outcome, he said. If you resign, I will accept it. But your work is too important to be buried under his politics. The card felt heavier than paper should. Elias's decision wasn't a dismissal. It was a move on a board I hadn't realized we were both standing on, and I needed to understand why he wanted me outside the company before the consequences hit. North River Analytics welcomed me with polite smiles and a stack of documents taller than my forearm. My short-term contract was framed as a neutral operational review, but the way their director, Dana Caldwell, looked at me told a different story. We appreciate you stepping in, Dana said, handing me the first binder. Windhaven's reports haven't aligned with our projections for months. Elias said you're the only person who can clarify the gaps. Only person. The words tightened something in my chest. I sat at a small table near Dana's office and opened the top file. The first page showed a timeline. I recognized my original workflow from Windhaven, but the next few pages were wrong. Steps removed, milestones relabeled, numbers smoothed into suspiciously neat patterns. I flagged one line and called Dana over. Where did this come from? Richard sent it, she said. He said the operations team approved the adjustments. I kept my voice steady. I never approved any of this. She frowned. Then why does his report claim you streamlined these processes? Because he needed Connor to look like a miracle worker. But I did not say that yet. 2 hours later, Dana returned with another file. Bella, look at these data logs. They don't match your original dependencies. She was right. They didn't. The logs timestamped as Connor's efficiency breakthroughs were identical to risk drafts I had written months earlier, drafts I never released. I called Jake at Windhaven. Did Richard access my archived files? He hesitated. Bella, he asked for credential overrides, said it was for a board audit. I didn't think it was fine, but I said quietly, though it wasn't. When I hung up, my hands were trembling. North River's documents weren't revealing a misunderstanding. They were revealing a pattern. Richard hadn't just altered reports. He had rewritten the truth brick by brick, hiding something deeper. And whatever he was hiding was dangerous enough to risk destabilizing the very company he claimed to protect. By the third day at North River, the files stopped whispering and started screaming. Every document I opened pointed to the same architect, Richard Langford. I laid 3 reports side by side on the table. Dana hovered behind me as I traced a line with my finger. This projection, I said, is built on Connor's supposedly improved throughput. Dana leaned closer. But this log, she tapped the second page, shows the original error streak. It shows your error streak. I corrected her. This was my preliminary draft. Connor copied it and changed the timestamps. She sucked in a breath. How many? Enough to make incompetence look like brilliance. The next file was worse. It contained budget reallocations I had never authorized. Tens of thousands shifted into Connor's pilot project. I flipped to the final page. Here, I said. He wrote that the savings came from my department. That is impossible. Dana's voice dropped. Bella, this is intentional. I nodded. He inflated Connor's performance metrics and buried every mistake under my name, and Richard approved all of it. Dana stepped out of the room and returned with the compliance lead. Marcus North, system flags inconsistencies. Marcus said, your findings triggered an automatic audit. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply handed him the folder. These are the discrepancies. Use them however protocol requires. He scanned the pages and let out a low whistle. This isn't sloppy. This is deliberate manipulation. Send it to Elias Mercer, I said, and the board. They need to see it exactly as it is. Marcus nodded. We will. Today. By late afternoon, North River's formal audit packet was already en route to Windhaven Systems, complete with signatures, timestamps, and confirmation that the altered files originated under Richard's authority. The facade he had built, slide by slide, meeting by meeting, was coming apart under its own weight, and one way or another, Richard was going to have to face the truth he'd buried. The emergency meeting happened less than 24 hours after North River sent the audit. I wasn't invited, but Jake called me the moment he stepped out of the boardroom. Bella, it was a disaster, he whispered. I could hear voices behind him, raised and frantic, cracking under pressure. Then Elias's voice cut through, steady and cold. Richard, explain the discrepancies. There was a rustle, a stammer, then Richard's strained reply. Those logs were taken out of context. Elias didn't soften. North River traced the files to your authorization, not context. Control. Another voice followed, Helen Rhodes from the board, sharpening the blow. You misled us, Richard, for months. Connor tried to jump in. Dad didn't mislead anyone. The data was misinterpreted. Sit down, Connor, Elias said. No anger, just command. Your revised workflow collapsed the minute Bella stepped out. The audit shows you removed required steps from a federally monitored contract. Connor's breath caught on the line. She could have helped if she hadn't quit. Helen cut him off. She quit because the two of you pushed her out, Jake whispered. Bella, you should have seen their faces. Another board member spoke next. Connor will step down from all project authority effective immediately. Connor sputtered. You can't. Elias overrode him. And Richard Langford is suspended pending full investigation. The room fell into a long, heavy silence. I could almost feel it through the phone. Fortunes shifting, reputations cracking like glass under weight. Then Helen said something I didn't expect. We owe Bella Harrington an apology. Jake exhaled. They all nodded. Even Elias. I pressed my hand to my chest, grounding myself, keeping my voice steady. Noted. I ended the call before the emotion could spill over. Justice was finally unfolding, but I still didn't know what that meant for me. Elias chose a small cafe near the Willamette River, far from Windhaven's glass walls and sterile conference rooms. When I walked in, he was already seated, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. He gestured to the chair across from him. Bella, sit. I did, keeping my posture steady even as my nerves hummed beneath my skin. He folded his hands. You handled this with remarkable discipline. I met his eyes. I handled the truth. That was all. That, he said quietly, was exactly what I needed you to do. I frowned. You needed me to leave Windhaven. I needed you outside Richard's reach, he replied. If you stayed, he would have buried you under enough false trails to confuse even the board. North River was the only place he couldn't tamper with your work. I let that settle. The resignation that had felt like an ending had been part of a larger plan, one I hadn't known I was standing inside. Elias leaned forward. Accuracy has always been your strength. You do not inflate numbers. You do not chase politics. You simply work in truth, and that is rare. I stayed silent, waiting. He placed a folder on the table. This is a long-term independent contract. You would consult for North River and for me directly, not as an employee, but as a partner. The word landed like a steady pulse in my chest. A partner, I repeated. Yes. Elias nodded. You will lead the operational architecture for the intercompany initiatives we begin next quarter. No internal sabotage, no political interference, full autonomy. I breathed in slowly, letting the weight of it settle. Not a return, not a second chance inside Windhaven. Something entirely different. Something that didn't require me to shrink to survive. I'll review the contract tonight, I said. Elias allowed the faintest smile. Take your time. This is your future to choose. As I left the cafe, I realized the vindication I had imagined, walking back into Windhaven victorious, was too small for the life opening in front of me. I signed the consulting contract with North River on a quiet Tuesday morning. No ceremony, no handshakes beyond Dana's warm smile. The signature felt less like closure and more like oxygen, finally reaching a part of me I had starved for too long. Later that afternoon, as I reviewed the first phase of Elias's upcoming initiative, Jake called. His voice was steady in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. It's official, he said. Richard's suspension became a full termination. Connor's out too. They said the falsified reports were enough to void any appeal. I exhaled slowly. It was their doing, not mine. Jake. I know, he replied. Everyone knows. He paused before adding, the company is restructuring. Compliance is rewriting half the policies. People keep saying your resignation didn't break Windhaven. The lies about you did. He hung up after promising to stay in touch, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle. For the first time in a long while, I felt neither vindicated nor angry. I felt free. Elias stopped by North River later that week. He didn't knock. He simply appeared in the doorway with that same unreadable calm. Settling in? I am, I said. Good, he replied. There's a second contract coming after this one. Larger. You'll lead it. I nodded. I'm ready. As he left, I realized how strange it was to be valued without having to defend my place at the table. I didn't need to return to Windhaven to prove anything. Not to the board. Not to those who doubted me. And not to the ones who tried to replace me with shortcuts and last names. I stepped out of the office and into the late afternoon light, the city humming around me. I hadn't rebuilt what Windhaven took. I had built something entirely different. Something that belonged to me. They once relied on me and pretended they didn't. Now they would rely on the systems I created without ever being able to touch me again.